Welcome everybody. I want to start off before any official welcome, just to make sure that you note that that this class is being recorded and will be shared publicly. If you wish not to appear or to be heard, please turn your camera and microphone off. If you wish not to appear at all, please change your name to initials or a nickname of your choosing, and certainly we respect your privacy. At this point, I'm gonna be muting everybody, and we're going to begin. Before I do begin, I just want to know, are there any questions that anybody has? I'll unmute everyone. Any questions anybody have or concern? I'm sorry?
Unmute.
Okay, I guess not. All right. Well, welcome. And it would really be much easier if everybody would have a copy of the book and to read it. We're going to be covering the introduction and the chapter 1 and 2, not all of chapter 2, because it is chock full of information, and I think it's really probably the most significant chapter. So I'm probably going to be just finishing up at a certain point in the chapter and then continuing in our next class and then move on to chapters 3 and 4. But in anticipation of people not having the book, that I have, so this will be more of a lecture, but also I have included like a PowerPoint it's not really PowerPoint, but quotes from the book that are pertinent as I go through the evening. So at this point, I'm going to be sharing the screen. Okay. Okay, welcome everyone. This is the Exodus, and the title is a subtitle of it, How It Happened and Why It Matters, by Richard Elliott Friedman. Friedman begins his book with 3 questions. Is the Exodus from Egypt a story or history? How did monotheism, the idea of there being only one God, come about? What person or events gave us the idea that we should love others as ourselves? 3 mysteries or 1? And I apologize for a second. I'm just checking to see if anybody has asked to be admitted. There is 1 person. Yeah, Jack and Judith, they're coming in. Okay, all right. So Friedman's fascination with the Exodus began with his viewing the epic film, The 10 Commandments, even though he already knew the story as a little boy. 40 years later, he served as a consultant on the animated film, The Prince of Egypt. What was it about the story of the Exodus that Friedman found so compelling? He states, the Exodus is the story of the birth of a nation and the birth of some cornerstone ideas. Practically everything that follows it in the Bible flows from it. the greatest concentration of the miracle, the first statement of the 10 Commandments, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the introduction of Moses as well as and Miriam, the early great prophets, the first priests. And how it happened. He saw a twofold argument as follows. His first point is that the Exodus from Egypt described in the Torah was a real historical event, but the number of people that left was much, much smaller than described. His second point is that the Levites were the ones that made the Exodus, not the entirety of the Israelite nation. And by the way, I just saw something that came up, a little flash that says my connection is a little unstable. Am I clear? Can everyone hear me clearly? Yes? Okay. All right. To prove this, he discusses linguistic, archaeological, and genetic forms of evidence that support his conclusions. The event figures centrally in the very earliest texts of prose, poetry, and law in the Bible. He concludes the introduction by stating that without the historical anchor of the Exodus, we would not have rise the idea of monotheism. And without the experience of that returning group from Egypt, we might not have had the ethic of caring for the stranger. Monotheism and loving others as ourselves, two radical developments, major developments in human consciousness, became embodied in the heart of Western religion. I taught my students that to prove one's point, one should always cite evidence that contradicts your position, thereby strengthening your thesis, hopefully. To prove that the Exodus was an actual historical event, Friedman discusses the ongoing debate between biblical scholars and archaeologists who say the Exodus happened and those scholars who say it never happened. Using the process of literary historical method, Friedman asks what was happening in their world that made them tell their story this way. By examining ancient texts, we hope to frame an historical account of a particular period by understanding the world the texts describe. A distinguished Egyptologist, I skipped one. William Foxwell Albright and his student successor, George Ernest Wright, Friedman's teacher, presented archaeological evidence confirming much of the Bible. People in the Christian and Jewish community are trusting archaeology rather than seeing it as a threat. Not everyone agreed with Albright and Wright, and what resulted was a healthy debate among biblical archaeologists as to the veracity of the biblical accounts of the Exodus. A distinguished Egyptologist, Donald Redford, wrote, "The Exodus was part and parcel of an array of origin of stories to which the Hebrews fell their heir upon their settlement of the land, and which, lacking traditions of their own, they appropriated from the earlier culture they were copying." David Sperling, a Bible professor at a Reformed Rabbinical Seminary, wrote, "The evidence from archaeology has been decisive. The traditions of servitude in Egypt, the tales of wandering in the desert, and the stories of the conquest of the Promised Land appear to be fictitious." A conservative rabbi in Los Angeles, David Wolpe, said in a Passover sermon in 2001, "The truth is that virtually every modern archaeologist who has investigated the Exodus, with very few exceptions, agrees that the way that the Bible describes the way it happened, if it happened at all." Around the same time, Lee Levine, a historian and archaeologist who was also a rabbi, wrote an essay that conceded the possibility that the Exodus occurred, wrote, These few indirect pieces of evidence are far from adequate to corroborate the biblical account, but they do suggest a contextual background. I apologize. Contextual background for the Egyptian servitude of at least some of the people who later became Israelites and the appearance of a new population in Canaan. Nevertheless, in reality, it was a folk tradition with little or no historical basis. In 2001, American archaeologist William Deaver, he wrote, "Archaeological investigations of Moses and the Exodus has been discarded as a fruitless pursuit. Indeed, the overwhelming archaeological evidence today of largely indigenous origins for early Israel leaves no room for an exodus from Egypt or a 40-year pilgrimage through the Sinai wilderness." I apologize for that spelling. A Moses-like figure may have existed, but archaeology can do nothing to confirm such a figure as a historical personage. So at this particular point, looking at these different viewpoints, I also found to be very interesting that most of these observations, and these were written in 2001. I am not sure if it was after 9/11 or not, but I wonder, if there might be some kind of weird coincidence, given the fact that the way that the world was being perceived at that time, especially with the challenges between the Western nations and the Eastern nations, specifically against Muslim nations. Friedman writes, he asked the question, no Exodus, no evidence, no Moses. How did this happen? How did we shift from archaeology proves the Bible to archaeology disproves the Exodus in just a few decades? Part of the answer lies in the politics of biblical archaeology. Since there was no real archaeological evidence to prove that the Exodus happened, the public assumed that it didn't happen. On the other hand, those biblical scholars who delved into and pored over the biblical texts, and I emphasize the biblical texts, came away with a different take. A slight shift back to the center led scholars and archaeologists to state that the Exodus did happen, just not the way it's described in the Torah. Eric Klein wrote, "We do not have a single shred of evidence to date. There is nothing available archaeologically to attest to anything from the biblical story. No plagues, no parting of the Red Sea, no manna from heaven, no wandering for 40 years. However, I should add that there is no archaeological evidence that proves that it did not take place. So at this time, the archaeological record can neither be used to confirm nor deny the existence of the Exodus." Friedman added the italics to emphasize this point. We look at the biblical accounts of the miracles, the splitting of the Red Sea, the Nile turning to blood, and the slaying of the Egyptian firstborn for examples. We know the biblical account, but those who want to believe the event happened differently might say the following. The sea was at low tide. The Nile can turn red due to a certain type of algae, which under the right conditions makes the water turn red like blood. The firstborn have the richest diets, so they contract illnesses and die. Of the three examples that I cited, only the Nile turning to blood has any credence. The Red Sea, actually the Sea of Reeds, does not experience tides as we know them. As for the firstborn dying from illnesses contracted from eating rich foods, it's blank. Use your imagination, all right, in terms of that. I remember reading an account by two professors who are climatologists, both happened to be at Florida State University, who described, using the biblical description The fact that a great wind came in from the east and blew the water aside, leaving a dry land. And they said under certain conditions that possibly could have happened. But again, there is no real proof, no real scientific proof to evidence this. Friedman's brief discussion of how many Israelites left Egypt is also very interesting. The Torah states that 603,550 males left Egypt. If we assume that their wives and at least one child left Egypt with the men, the number of Israelites swelled to 2 million. Is it possible that they could have traveled together for 40 years, that many people could have traveled together for 40 years? There have been other examples of long treks in history involving thousands of people. The most notable being the Long March in China under Mao Zedong in the 1930s. 100,000 set out and only 8,000 survived. Needless to say, 2 million people marching for 40 years seems like a rather improbable task. Friedman offers us different explanations as to whether the Exodus happened, but what it boils down to is the following. What happened, and what is the connection between that, what happened, and the way that the Bible's authors write the story? That is where the historical study and the literary study of the Bible come together. In chapter 1, Friedman outlines the issues facing biblical archaeologists and biblical historians as to the veracity of the Exodus. The doubters say, no remnants of 2 million people found in the Sinai desert, no records in Egypt of hundreds of thousands of Israelite slaves or a huge exodus, no widespread evidence of Egyptian culture in early Israel. Three questions need to be addressed. First, did the Hebrews go down to Egypt, settle in Goshen, and then multiply by hundreds of thousands as described in the Bible, only to have Pharaoh enslave them and murder all the firstborn Israelite babies because he feared the Egyptians would be overwhelmed by the Hebrews? Second, what was the actual number of slaves? Who ultimately made the Exodus? Third, who were they? Friedman discusses the 10 bodies of evidence to answer these questions and to prove that only the Levites made up the Exodus. According to Friedman, there were Western Asiatic people in Egypt. Call them Asiatics, Semites, Canaanites, Levantine peoples. But whatever we call them, these aliens were there for hundreds of years. The literature on this is voluminous. They were everything from lower class and slaves, called variously Shasu, Apiru, Habiru, to a dynasty of pharaohs, the Hyksos, the 15th dynasty. And they were coming and going all along, just not millions at a time. We could say there were many exoditos. The idea that our Exodus was one of these is well within reason. Citing several archaeological and historical scholars, he says there is agreement that immigrants from Canaan or Canaan did go to Egypt and settle there, that some of those were enslaved by Egyptians, left Egypt, and settled in Canaan, joining up with Israelites who have been living there for hundreds of years. More about this later. In Who Wrote the Bible, which many of you attended that course earlier in the year, Friedman posited that just the Levites were the only ones who left Egypt, became the priests of Israel, and were some of the main authors of the Bible. Moses and Aaron were Levites. Their father and mother were Levites. What evidence does Friedman present that it was the Levites who made the Exodus and about whom we retell the story every Passover? He explains that it is only the Levites who had Egyptian names: Hophni, Hur, two men named Phineas, Merari, Mushi, Pashur, and Moses. No other Israelites have Egyptian names. He then goes on to cite two biblical scholars, Frank Moorcross and David Noel Friedman, who argue that the two oldest songs in the Bible are the Song of the Sea, or Song of Miriam, as he actually says it, and the Song of Dempra. Why are they important? Both are associated with women, Miriam and Deborah. And now, how many of you do have a copy of the book? I can't see everyone. Let's see here. Let me get this. All right. You know the poem, and it is a poem or a song. You know the Hebrew where it begins Az Yashir Moshe Uvnei Israel, all right? Az Yashir. And we sing it. We have a melody for it. There are many different melodies. Az Yashir Moshe Uvnei Israel, right? Okay. That's a narrative. That's not part of the Song of the Sea. It begins, let me sing to Yahweh, for he triumphed. Horse and its rider, he cast in the sea. My strength and song are Yah, and he became a salvation for me. So throughout the entire Song of the Sea, he points out some interesting points. The song never mentions numbers, no walls of water, but that something terrible happened that caused the Egyptians to drown. The name Israel is never mentioned in the poem. It is mentioned in that first line, but that's not part of the poem. That's the narrative, all right? And to where does Yahweh lead the people? And here in the quote here it says, to his holy abode. He plants them in his legacy mountain at the Lord's sanctuary, the Mikdash, where his throne's platform is. All of these are references to the temple or tabernacle, and the Levites were priests, and they were the only ones permitted to have access to the temple. Either A, the Song of Dempra is found in the book of Judges. It never mentions the Exodus. Friedman says it's because it was written in the 12th or 11th century BCE. It celebrates the Israelites' victory over King Hazor of the Canaanites and names the 10 tribes of Israel that contributed to the victory. We have some people wanting to come in. 1 second. One tribe is missing, Levi. Why? Either A, the Levites were not there yet, they were in Egypt or on the road, or B, the Levites were not a tribe of Israel going into battle. They were a priestly group dispersed among the tribes. Friedman cites Noel Friedman, who references the oracle of Levi in the blessing of Moses, in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 33, verses 8 to 11. Essentially, all the oracles in Moses' blessing, the oracle of Levi is the only one that focuses on the wilderness experience. And that is because none of the other tribes experienced the Exodus, nor traveled in the desert. Conversely, Levi never had a designated area in or abutting Israel. Friedman strengthens his thesis by looking at the authors of the Bible. In Who Wrote the Bible, he states that there are 4 major authors. J, Yahweh is God's name in German because J is sounded like a Y and is known by humans from the beginning of creation, but it's not revealed until Moses. E for El or Elohim is a generic term to describe God. P is the priestly source, and D is the author of most of the book of Deuteronomy. The last 3 books, E, P, and D, were written by Levites. J was not. Although J is present in all 4 sources, J is predominantly associated with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. To further his point, Friedman writes that Yahweh is mentioned 9 times in the Song of the Sea. Not once is El or Elohim mentioned. Why? Because El was only used in Israel. Once the Levites arrived in Canaan, they reunited with the Israelites and they spread out among the tribes. Over time, Yahweh and El are God, and this is evident because El or Elohim and Yahweh are used interchangeably throughout the Bible. We have discussed the first 2 pieces of evidence Friedman uses to support his position that only the Levites left Egypt and brought their customs and traditions to Israel, and over time became interwoven into Israelite society. That leaves 8 more to examine. The third one bear with me for 1 second. Is the Tabernacle and the battle tent of Ramses. The whole country of Israel did not have cultural connections back to Egypt, but the Levites, and only the Levites, did have cultural connections. The Levite priest's description of their tabernacle, the sacred tent of meeting, is long and detailed. It is obviously was extremely important to them. There is, in fact, more about the tabernacle than about anything else in the 5 books of Moses. The tabernacle has architectural parallels with the battle tent of the Pharaoh Ramses II. And here I will just stop for 1 second. There are numbers of ritual objects that are described in the Torah after we leave Egypt. One of them is the tefillin, the phylacteries. And there are 4 different references to the tefillin, and they're never ever given a name. In each of them, it says they shall be a sign upon their hand. And in one is, in the first time, a memorial or reminder between your eyes, or generally speaking, the totafot beinecha, frontlets. Again, we don't know what they were. Assuming that what we're used today for the tefillin, that they might have been some kind of amulet or some kind of object that was used in Egypt by maybe the priests themselves, the Egyptian priests. Again, we're not really sure, but that was something that was really important, just as an aside. The idea of the tabernacle, where did they bring this tabernacle? Where did the concept come from? Well, Friedman and several others, they really believe that the tabernacle was actually copied after the battle tent of the Pharaoh Ramses II. What is that? Its shape, its size, proportions, surrounding courtyard, golden winged accoutrements, Eastern orientation, and arrangement of outer and inner rooms are a match. Friedman's own calculations of the tabernacle's construction differ in some ways from Holman's, but still he acknowledged that's another person, another biblical scholar who is also really looks at the tabernacle and its influence by the battle tent of Ramses. But he still acknowledges enough of a match that the connection is visible. The Levite sources of the Torah mention the tabernacle or tent of meeting over 200 times. And how many times does the non-Levite source J refer to it? 0. Another professor, Professor Nogel, in another combination of Bible and archaeology, showed parallels between the Levite priest description of the Ark of the Covenant and the Egyptian barks. A bark was essentially they're a boat, but in this particular case here, these barks were actually carried by Egyptians from one area to another, from one place to a holy place. All right. These barks were rarely set in water. They were carried in processions. They were sacred ritual objects, and like the ark that the Levites carry in Israel, the barks were sometimes gold-plated. Many were decorated with winged cherubs or birds. They were carried on poles by priests, and they served as a throne and footstool. If you want to read the article by Nagel, I read the essay. It's rather lengthy. It's about 20 pages long. So I felt that I wasn't going to share that with you tonight because we might be here till midnight. And I felt that that wasn't really fair to everybody. But this is, Nagel's, his essay really does focus on the fact that the bark served as a model, which the Israelites adapted for their own needs. And as I said before, the same thing is tefillin. So what we're getting here is a picture that we're looking at religious objects, the tent of the meeting at the tabernacle, and then also with the tefillin. These are religious objects. The Levites became the priests. The priests controlled prayer, and they were the only ones that had access to the temple. They were the only ones that had the access to the tabernacle when they were in the desert. Again, another religious function, circumcision. It is in the text written by Levites that give the requirement to practice circumcision. Circumcision was a known practice in Egypt. The biblical text requires circumcision in the Levite priestly covenant between God and Abraham in Genesis and the Levite priestly law in Leviticus. Levite authors, and only Levite authors, use the metaphor of circumcision of the heart, which is found both in Leviticus 26, chapter 41, and Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 16, and chapter 30, verse 6. The metaphor of circumcision of one's heart also appears in 2 prophets, Jeremiah and Ezekiel. And it happens that both of these 2 famous prophets, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, were Levite priests. The Levite priestly writer in Exodus also uses the metaphor of Moses' uncircumcised lips in chapter 10, Exodus chapter 6, verse 10. All 11 of these references to circumcision appear only in Levite sources. The non-Levite source J, meanwhile, tells nothing about circumcision except in stories, not in instructions or legal contexts. In J, circumcision is not a law and not a requirement of the covenant. It comes up in 2 episodes. The first is the strange J story of Moses' Midianite wife Zipporah, who does something to somebody for some reason at a lodging place when they are on their way to Egypt. It is a brief story, only three verses. But essentially what it really comes down to is the fact is that this was a practice, but specifically as far as a legal requirement, only it comes up in Levite documents. There are so many parallels with Egyptian traditions. The biblical motifs of the hidden divine name, turning an inanimate object into a reptile, which we see in the miracles, the conversion of water to blood, a spell of 3 days of darkness, the death of the firstborn, the parting of waters, and death by drowning are all paralleled in Egyptian texts, and for the most part, nowhere else. In some, the narrative that encompasses Exodus 1 through 15 evokes the Egyptian setting at every turn. And what about the story of the plagues and the Exodus? It is the sources that come from the Levites, E, P, and D, that tell the whole story of the plagues on Egypt, leading to the people's exodus. J, the version that was not written by a Levite, does not tell it at all. If you were to read the Levite sources E, P, and D, you learn of 10 plagues on Egypt, rivers turning to blood, frog infestation, lice, an insect swarm, a livestock epidemic, boils, hail, locusts, a 3-day darkness, and finally death of firstborn humans and animals. In these sources, you read of the competition with the Egyptian sorcerers who attempt and ultimately fail to reproduce the plagues. In these sources, you read of the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, which keeps the plagues coming. And then you read of Egypt's capitulation and the people's departure, the Exodus. You get all of this and more in the Levite sources, E, P, and D. It goes on for 9 chapters, Friedman says. But if you read J, you find none of this. It jumps from Moses saying, "Let my people go," Exodus 5, verse 1, to the people's already having departed Egypt in chapter 13, verse 21. The Pharaoh answers the first demand with, "I won't let Israel leave," and he's not mentioned again until he heard that the people had fled. Who knows what story, if any, came between? The plagues and Exodus story comes entirely from the Levite sources. Interestingly, J has a story of plagues in Egypt, but it is set in the time of Abraham, not in the time of the Exodus. We now turn to an area that, another concept, the whole idea of the fact is being kind to a stranger, and also the whole issue of slavery and the Jewish concept of slavery. Friedman says, and I'm quoting him, "I am among the many readers who love detective fiction. I especially relish when all the different parts of the mystery come together and finally make sense. Similarly here, we have looked at poetry, prose, material culture, traditional lore, and names. And now still another category of evidence comes together with them, law. Only Levite sources, E, P, and D, have laws of how to treat slaves. The Bible does not abolish slavery. It limits it. It gives slaves rights, sometimes not always the same rights as free people. It limits the situations in which one can acquire slaves, and it puts certain limits on how long one may keep them. It forbids one from mistreating a slave. If you capture a female in war, you must marry her or set her free, but you may not enslave her. If one acquires a fellow Israelite as a slave, one must let the slave go free after 6 years. And one must also give the freed slave provisions. And here's the quote from Deuteronomy: "You shall provide him from your flock and from your threshing floor and from your winepress, as Yahweh, your God, has blessed you, you shall give to him." And that is from Deuteronomy. And why must one do this? And you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and Yahweh your God redeemed you. On account of this, I command you this thing. With these laws about treating slaves, which were explicitly traced to having been slaves themselves in Egypt, come up so much in the three Levite sources. There are no laws about slaves at all in the non-Levite source, J. Now, one might say that this is simply because the J source does not include law codes at all, except for the Ten Commandments. That is true, but even there is the J version of the Ten Commandments. Its law of Sabbath rest does not include slaves. The other two occurrences of the Ten Commandments refer to slaves both in their very first verse, I brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of slaves, and in their Sabbath commandment, which requires that one's slaves are not to be made to work on the Sabbath. But the Decalogue does not give slaves the day off or show any interest in slaves at all. In fact, the non-Levite J source does not even have the word slave any time after Genesis. It is unclear in what way the Egyptians oppressed the Israelite in J. It must be some kind of forced labor because the text refers to taskmasters, but that is the closest it comes. And also the issue of how we treat aliens, how we treat foreigners. And of course, this is a major topic. We see this today throughout the world, not just in the United States, but also in Europe and in other countries in the Middle East, how foreigners are treated. Over and over 52 times, all three Levite sources command that one must never mistreat an alien. The first occurrence of the word Torah in the Torah is the command, there shall be one Torah for the citizen and for the alien who lives among you, from the book of Exodus. Why should an Israelite not mistreat an alien? What is the reason for this Israelite obsession with not oppressing a foreigner who is in their country? All three Levite sources answer word for word the same, because you were aliens in Egypt. Indeed, biblical law forbids an Israelite to disdain an Egyptian. Why? You shall not abhor an Egyptian, because you were an alien in his land. This law too comes in a Levite source in Deuteronomy. And we have other examples in terms of how we're reminded how to treat the Egyptians. And at this particular point, I'm going to take a break and ask people if they have any questions. So you can unmute, and or I can unmute everybody. I can do that. And so, is there anybody who has a question? Is there something that you would like me to clarify?
Or Steve, do you need a screen share?
Actually, I don't think I need it anymore. I think I'm all done with the screen share. So I will get off of that. Thank you very much. Okay, good. All right. I see there's one question. Okay. Oh, I see. Okay. All right. So anybody have any thoughts, any questions, any commentary? I'm almost done for this evening. So just, it's good to see a lot of people back from previously. Jack and Judith, good to see you. Bob, Marcy, Rosita, Phyllis, Morris, Yael. So it's good to see a lot of people. I think, Susan, were you with us in the first, when I did Who Wrote the Bible? I guess not. Okay. So in terms of any particular, like, for example, this last one in terms of dealing with the Egyptians, can you think of anything where we are reminded of the Egyptians and the slavery that we encountered in Egypt, the treatment that we encountered by the Egyptians, and then when we left, what happened to the Egyptians when they drowned in the sea, in the Red Sea, or in the Sea of Reeds. And there is a midrash. If you remember that midrash, does anybody remember? Yael, I'm sure you know the midrash, that when the angels are dancing and singing as the Egyptians are drowning, and what does God say to them?
They're all human beings.
He said, "They're all my children. Why are you dancing and lingering? Why are you, when they're drowning and they're dying? They're all my children." Okay. And we have specifically, because it's associated with the holiday of Passover, so we have specific customs on Passover related to specific rituals that we perform. Okay. When we light candles and when we recite Kiddush on the Chagim, on the first day of the Chagim, or the first 2 days in Galut, outside of Israel, what prayer do we add at the end of the candle lighting and at the end of Kiddush? We say the bracha we say Lahadlik Ner Shel Yom Tov, all right? And then we say a second blessing. Shehechianu. All right? And we also add Shehechianu to the Kiddush, to the Kiddush, when we make Kiddush over the wine. Only on the first 2 days of Passover. For the last 2 days of Passover, we do not say Shehechianu. In the morning service, we recite Hallel because it's a Chag. When it's a Chag, we recite full Hallel. On Rosh Chodesh, we recite, they call it a half Hallel. It's not really a half, it's more like 2/3, all right, or 3/4. But we call it a half, Cheti Hallel. And say that again?
Wow.
On to the concept of Kaddish, right? So the custom that from
I'm sorry? Okay. So when we recite Hallel, on the Chag, we recite the full Hallel. On the last 6 days of Passover, because we also recite Hallel at the morning services during the week, Chol HaMoed, we only recite the half Hallel. This is done in remembrance of the fact that the Egyptians suffered, they drowned so that we could survive. So those are 2 instances. And can anybody think of a third at the Seder?
When you stick you do the drops of wine for the plagues.
Correct. Exactly. Right. We reminded the 10 plagues, so we do that. But the fact is that we remind ourselves, we take away from our joy, our complete joy of celebrating our freedom, that the plagues, the Egyptians suffered because of these plagues. And then there's also the extra 3 that we add, all right, that we do that too. So 13 drops of wine are detracted from the full cup. So all of these reminders and remembrances are really, important. That there is the idea of the fact that we remember the Egyptians. We remember that they suffered, despite the fact that they made us slaves for over 400 years. Okay. All right. So we're going to conclude. I'm just going to sum up again, just giving you these references. And you can find these on page 64 of the book. And I do hope you get the book, because it really is a good read. It's very interesting. All right. So I do implore you, you have 2 weeks, before our next class, which is on the 9th of March. Okay. So in sum, I'm just going to kind of like read what Friedman wrote in his book, is kind of like summing up these particular points that prove that the Levites were the ones that exited Egypt in the Exodus. So number 1, he says 8 out of 8 Israelites with Egyptian names are Levites. 2 out of 2 accounts of the revelation of God's name make it to the Levite Moses. and are told in Levite sources. The massive treatment of the tabernacle, which parallels the Egyptian tent of Ramses II, appears in the Levite priest sources. The ark, which is entrusted to the Levites, parallels the Egyptian barks. 7 out of 7 items of Egyptian lore that come up in the biblical story occur in Levite sources. 11 out of 11 references to circumcision in legal context, literal or metaphorical, occur in Levitical sources in the Torah and the prophets. And the 2 references to it in the stories involve the Levite Moses and Levi himself. 3 out of 3 sources that tell the story of the plagues in Exodus are Levite sources. All texts treating slavery during and after the Egyptian stay are Levite sources. 52 out of 52 references to aliens occur in Levite sources. 52 references to the sanctuary, the Mikdash, in the Bible, which is where the people in the Song of the Sea go, identify it as the temple or tabernacle, the shrines to which only the Levites are allowed access. Okay. So on this particular note, I think this is a good time where I'm going to end this evening. Marcy, you have a question? Or you raised your hand or something?
I raised the hand to thank you, Steve.
All right. It's again, it's good to see everybody, and I hope that we'll see you again on the 9th. And also wishing you a Chag Purim Sameach, that you enjoy, that you do Purim. It'll be different this year. We won't be getting together, but you can see the family service Megillah reading where the kids performed and where they read, and the kids performed in the band and doing musical things with Elias. So enjoyed that. And also we have the traditional Megillah reading that'll be at 7:30, right after that. All right. So Chag Purim Sameach, and be well, stay safe, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Okay.
Thank you, Steve. Bye.
Thank you, Steve.
Bye. Thank you,
Bye.
Steve.
Thank you.
Steve,
night.
did you get my email?
We're recording right now. Let me end
Oh,
the recording.
hi, Mr. and Mrs. Recorder.
Okay, I stopped it.
I sent you an email about Purim. You can check.
Yeah.
Okay, all right.